excited to co-sponsor this event together at the Decalogue Society. And I'm a strong believer in how you need to have laws and values, and it's difficult, I think, to have values without some understanding of what faith is and how it's practiced. And nobody I know, has thought more about the intersection between faith and intellectual property rights, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, than Professor Kwall. And so we are delighted that the Decalogue Society managed to snag a superstar like Professor Kwall and get her back at John Marshall in 2 consecutive years. Mm-hmm. So we hope to keep up our batting average. And it's wonderful also to see all of you here virtually. I think it's a great opportunity, as Ben said, to take our minds off the tensions and excitement of the elections and focus on something I think that's real meaningful. And I hope that you will listen carefully to what Professor Kwall has to say and think about the application of the law, not just in the very technocratic and legalistic sense of the word, but also think about the underlying values and what the law is trying to achieve as well. So thank you again, Ben, and to your colleagues, and welcome, Professor Kwall.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Ben.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you for inviting me and organizing this event, and the Decalogue Board, with whom I met about a week ago. It's always a pleasure. Professor Lim and I go way back, and it's always a pleasure to always be here. And yes, I was at John Marshall. I think it was just about a year ago. It was a very different world then, but this is really nice to be here with you today virtually. So I want to talk about how the Jewish tradition thinks about human creativity, and why is that important for intellectual property law. As I often joke, Jewish law is not on the bar exam, right? So and yet here you have a law professor who at this point is pretty much spending the majority of her time thinking and writing about Jewish law. By the way, I'm going to put one little plug in for my brand new book. This is my brand new book, Remixed Judaism: Preserving Tradition in a Diverse World. This is actually, as Ben was saying, how we connected. That book is about how you can take religious tradition, and I write in the context of Jewish tradition, but I think there's a basis, and I think the themes that I develop really are applicable to lots of other religious traditions, including Catholicism. DePaul is a Catholic school, of course, but it's really about how you take the traditions and you can remix them to make them more meaningful to you, even if you're not living a strictly observant religious life. And that's really what Remixed Judaism is about. So today, yes, Jewish law is not on the bar, but it's important. I think there's an important connection between what Jewish tradition says about why humans create and what the law that protects human creativity should look like. And so you might wonder, how did I get here, right? How did I get from, writing about intellectual property law, which I primarily did for more years than I'm going to acknowledge right now. I started my legal career writing about intellectual property. One of my first big articles was on moral rights. It was published in the Vanderbilt Law Review many, many years ago. And yet in the early years of where we are now, around 2000, 2001, I started to sort of think about the question of whether there was anything in Jewish tradition that we could learn in order to better protect works of authorship. And I found so much. And what I found in the Jewish tradition actually has been embraced by Christianity, and those who think about this issue from a Christian perspective, as well as by the theorists who write about creativity from a completely secular perspective, but who write about it from a psychological perspective, for example. And everything that that these authors and writers have been writing about, the process of human creativity actually is steeped in Jewish tradition. And so we're going to talk about why that is today. So I'm going to start with a couple of narratives that I think really set the stage nicely. And one of these narratives has to do with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was the woman who pioneered the 5 stages of grief, in terms of death, dying, acceptance, etc. And how she learned, or why she decided to spend her career thinking about death and dying and the 5 stages of grief actually began when she went to visit the concentration camps after World War II. And what did she see when she looked at the barracks of Auschwitz and some of the other camps? Was she saw the butterflies that were carved into the wood on the camps that were made by the children that were about to be put to death by the Nazis. And she said she could never forget that image was sort of seared in her brain and really shaped her research for the rest of her life. Because what she realized is that even facing death, people need to create beauty through art. That's a remarkable insight. And I think it's an insight that's really important when it comes to thinking about how the law should protect the output of authors. And when I use the term authors, I'm talking about all types of authors, not just visual artists, but anyone who creates. I want to take you now to a narrative involving the sculptor Frederick Hart. Frederick Hart is the creator of a sculpture called Ex Nihilo, which adorns the Washington National Cathedral. He spent 13 years creating the sculpture Ex Nihilo. And by the way, during that time, he actually converted to Catholicism. All right, he wasn't a religious man, and then he became a practicing Catholic during the time the 13 years he was working on this sculpture. So Ex Nihilo depicts the creation of mankind out of the torrential void. Okay, I assume most people here have some familiarity, whatever your religion may be, with the Old Testament, because it's the foundation for all of the major religions, right? And so you know those creation narratives. I'm going to be speaking more about them in a little bit, and really Ex Nihilo is about, again, the creation of mankind out of the void, out of the torrential void. So what happened was Warner Brothers took a near exact duplicate of the sculpture Ex Nihilo, and they used it as the backdrop for the final scene in the movie The Devil's Advocate. Now, what happens in that movie at the end, as some of you may know or remember, is that that movie is about the devil coming to earth in the form of what else? A corporate lawyer, portrayed by Al Pacino. And he, at the end of the movie, he actually encourages his offspring to engage in incest. And the backdrop for that scene is the torrential void swirling around, and it's an image. It's a reproduction of Ex Nihilo. The only problem is, of course, they never cleared that with Frederick Hart, who was, needless to say, very upset that his work was being used in this kind of context, which he tremendously disapproved of as a person of faith. I mean, this was the backdrop for an incest scene. As you can imagine, he wasn't happy. All right, so ultimately Warner Brothers entered into a settlement with Hart, but his agony, his narrative of pain, right? Pain was tellingly real when he revealed the following. I quote, this is a quote: "I feel absolutely outraged that a work that was meant to express the great majesty and beauty and mystery of God's creation, his work, has been so radically perverted." Okay, so in the United States, we have a tradition for protecting works of authorship, and that tradition is largely economically focused. Some of you may be familiar with the workings of copyright law, and you know that everything that copyright law protects has an economic bent to it. It guarantees the right to reproduce, the right to publicly perform and distribute, the right to display, the right to create new works based on the original. All of these are economically based rights. And that's great. I mean, after all, we're a capitalist country. We have a strong capitalist history. And there's nothing, of course, wrong with protecting an author's economic rights. The problem is that the act of authorship, the act of creativity, also involves motivations that are not based just on money. And for many creators, and think about, Kubler-Ross's, the narrative involving Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that I opened with, it's not at all about money, right? It's not at all about money. It's about something else. I mean, even my book, this just occurred to me, my book, Remixed Judaism, that I poured 3 years of my life into writing and years before thinking about. It wasn't about money. It's not about money. I didn't show you this book because I want to get royalties. I wrote this book because I'm passionate about the topic I'm writing about. To me, that's the type of motivation. It's a spiritual motivation, which is completely unprotected, virtually completely unprotected in the laws of the United States. In the United States, we do have some tiny, skinny protection for an author's personal rights in her creation. And by that, I mean the right to safeguard attribution, the right to safeguard the integrity of your work. Okay. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in just a minute. But it's a very narrow scope of protection compared to the whole rest of the world. I mean, this is really kind of interesting when it comes to this right to protect an author's meaning and message of her work through moral rights. The United States is completely out of step, and I'm going to suggest barely, if any, in compliance with the Berne Convention, compared to the laws of every other country that you can think of. It's quite remarkable, actually. It's quite remarkable. So the way that in other countries, these inspirational motivations are protected are through moral rights laws that basically protect the meaning of a work and the message of a work by safeguarding the author the right to be attributed as he or she desires, whether it's with your own name or anonymously or pseudonymously. Okay, whatever, but to have attribution, that's not protected in the United States. Okay, when you sign a contract to get your work published, you are not necessarily guaranteed attribution by virtue of the law. You may get that through your contract provisions, but attribution is not covered by copyright. And what happens if your work is modified in a way that you don't agree with and you don't approve of, or your work is used in a context that you object to? Again, we're in political season, but the political campaigns is a primary way that songs often get used without the permission or the desires of the authors or the singers that publicize the song, and they end up being used in campaigns by politicians that the singers and the artists, don't approve of, right? There's no remedy for that. If there's copyright permission to use that song, the fact that the context is not what the author would have approved is completely irrelevant. So these are the kinds of problems that come up. And in the United States, we don't have a viable solution to them. All right. So my purpose today is not necessarily to delve into what the laws of moral rights should look at, although I'm happy to have that conversation during the course of our time together. But I've written a lot about that. But instead, what I really want to do is understand creativity from the Jewish tradition and how the Jewish tradition can inform and should inform, and frankly does inform, the discourse on what the law ought to look like. So that's really what my goal is for our time together today. Now, if you're going to talk about the Jewish tradition and what it says about human creativity, the starting point is the book of Genesis. In Hebrew, we call it Bereshit, but that's the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, because that's the book. That's the beginning of the Bible. It's the beginning of the Torah. It's where God creates the world. Now, as an aside, I have something kind of, interesting, I hope, to share with you. To my knowledge, all right, I believe that the first documented moral rights violation occurs at the very beginning of the Bible, the Torah, in the book of Genesis. So I'm going to tell you what I think the very first documented moral rights violation is. Okay. And ladies, listen up, because this is a win for the ladies. All right. So let's go back to Adam and Eve. We're going to go back to Adam and Eve, right? And you all remember who always gets blamed for Adam eating the poisonous fruit. Of course, it's the woman, right? So let's see what really happened here, and let's talk about whose fault it really, really was, okay? And it wasn't Eve's, it was her spouse's. So here's what happened. If you look at the language in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, what you see is that God commands Adam not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge, okay? And that's in chapter 2, verse 17, for those of you who want to check what I'm saying. But then in chapter 3, verse 3, Eve tells the cunning little serpent she can't eat or touch it, all right? And so the way Jewish tradition works is you've got the Torah, what again, all of us here know as the Bible, the Old Testament, but Jewish tradition really incorporates thousands of years of rabbinic commentary on the Torah, and particularly in the early years of the Common Era, when the oral tradition that according to Jewish tradition was handed down with the written law was being discussed and debated by the rabbis. And so what I'm now going to share comes from the rabbinic tradition. Again, this is in the period of the Talmud, which is again the early, maybe the first 500 years of the Common Era. And it goes back a long, long time. So the rabbis, have an explanation for how this happened. And this is what the rabbis have to say about how this happened. So listen up for the moral rights violation. So according to what the rabbis tell us, the serpent pushes Eve against the tree, okay, because she said, she's not allowed to eat the fruit or touch it. So the serpent pushes Eve against the tree, and her hand, smacks the tree. And the serpent said, oh, look, you just touched the tree. Nothing happened to you. You can eat the fruit, right? That's how the rabbis interpret that. But then the question is, well, how did that happen? How was the serpent able to do this? All right, so the tradition explains the following. Adam wanted to add a safeguard to Eve, okay? So Adam basically said, God said to Adam, don't eat the fruit, okay? Going back to before, Adam was commanded not to eat the fruit. God said nothing about don't touching it. Adam adds, he adds a safeguard. When he was talking to Eve, he said, don't eat and don't touch it. But Adam didn't tell Eve that this was his own innovation. He didn't tell Eve that he's adding this safeguard. So what Adam did, I'm going to suggest to you, is he misattributed what God said, because that's not what God said. And he doesn't tell Eve that he was adding his own innovation. In other words, Adam violated God's moral rights. Yes. And so the downfall of humanity and the first recorded sin and the first documented moral rights violation really was because Adam violated God's moral rights. Ladies, we've been blamed for this from time immemorial, but according to the rabbis of the Talmud, I think they had this right. It wasn't our fault, right? Okay, some of you are smiling. I like to see that. This is a true story. This is exactly what the rabbinic tradition said. All right. Now, according to Jewish tradition, it's also interesting because in that period of when Jewish law began to be codified, again, the early period of the Common Era, first 500 years, give or take, of the Common Era, there's actually some actual Jewish law that actually recognizes moral rights, which is really interesting, and essentially, the Talmud tells us that, one must display indebtedness to a source and mention that source by name. So essentially, this is a prohibition against, plagiarism and being honest. And it's interesting to see that Jewish tradition actually takes this very, very seriously. But if we really want to understand, so that's like what Jewish law is saying about the issue, some of the issues we're talking about. But if you really want to understand what Judaism has to say about what motivates people to create, you really have to go back to the creation narratives in Genesis, and you have to look at, how the Torah describes God's creation of the world, because there is so much that we can learn about human motivations for creativity from these narratives in Genesis. All right, so that's what I'd like to focus on a little bit. So, first of all, if you go back to the language, okay, there are actually two creation narratives in Genesis. I'm not going to get into the details of where they are, or they're together, but they're separated. But they both, if you read the story in its entirety, there's a lot of really interesting insights that go to that address the question of what motivates humans to create. and why those non-economic, and none of them are economic, and why those non-economic motivations are so critical for understanding the process of human creativity. And that's really what I want to focus on now. So, by the way, think about the opening sentences of the Bible, of the Torah, of the book of Genesis. You know, you've got the deep, unformed darkness. You've got the water protecting the fragility of life. That's the womb, right? That imagery is all suggesting the womb. Now, why is that important? That's important because we're going to talk about a metaphor for creativity that's known as the parental metaphor of authorship. And so what we're suggesting is the Torah opens, okay, with this idea of the womb. Before the world is created, before God creates the world, there's this womb-like structure, all right? And I believe that's sort of meant to sort of, again, cement the birthing process of creativity. In the very beginning, and by the way, the word create, the English word create, is from the Latin word to give birth to, which actually substantiates, you know, what I've just suggested. All right, so at the very beginning, you know, we see in the very few first chapters of Genesis, we see a pathway that leads man to establish himself as a creator. All right, now this insight that the first opening passages of the book of Genesis actually furnishes a pathway for man to think of himself as a creator was actually the first time I saw that insight was in a book by the former Librarian of Congress, Daniel Boorstin. And he said that, and he was talking about the creation narratives in Genesis. And this was, I think I read that book. I spent a whole summer reading his book, The Creators. It's about 1,500 pages. And I just took one summer and just read that. And it gave me all these incredible insights for what I wanted to write about next, which is this notion of human creativity from a spiritual standpoint. But it was Daniel Boorstin's argument that made me think about that. And that was pretty interesting to me because I never put that together. I had read those narratives of Genesis, you know, every year, you know, because we read in the Jewish tradition, you read the entire 5 books of Moses every year, you know, you complete it. I've read that for many years at that point. Never occurred to me that this is a path for man to think of himself as a creator. It never dawned on me. But once I read that, it was like, wow, that's really deep. That's really interesting. All right. So early on, we see language that says God made man in his image. What does that mean, that we're created in the image of God? Okay, now we can have a lot of really interesting theological discussions about what that means. But what I want to focus on now is really the question of what does it mean for your artistic creations, you know, to be made in your own image. And so what Jewish tradition says is that by virtue of that language, creation, man mirrors God by creating. God is a creator. God created the world. God created man in his image, okay? And yet when humans create their own creations, they are mirroring God, okay? And so you have to sort of then think about what does that say about man's act of creativity and the way that man feels toward his or her own works of creativity. And that's where you get this parental metaphor of authorship, because what the tradition tells us is that just as God had a certain way of thinking about man and thinking about the work of his hands, and you see that attitude by God, love for man throughout the Old Testament, throughout the rabbinic literature, it's incredibly prevalent, okay? And you see that all the time. And what that shows is if man is going to mirror God, this deep spiritual connection that God feels toward mankind is the same kind of deep spiritual connection that our artists feel toward their work, the works of their creation. All right. So again, it's this important metaphor, this parental metaphor of authorship that establishes man's connection to his or her artistic works. So listen to some of these narratives that talk about this. So starting with the Jewish narratives, okay, Rabbi Akiva was one of the most important, well-known sages of the Talmud, again, going back 2,000 years roughly, but listen to what he says. Just as the existence of a house testifies to the builder and the existence of a garment testifies to the weaver, so the existence of the world testifies to God who fashioned it. Think about that connection, what that's saying between the connection between the author and her work. In testifying before Congress on the topic of film colorization, okay, bringing us into modern times, Elliot Silverstein, the Directors Guild of America, remarked, "Our compensation lies in very large part in the love of bringing art to life, in the satisfaction of realizing visions that we love, visions that we have carried in the wombs of our imagination. So our sensibilities are acutely bruised when we see our children publicly tortured and butchered by the various instruments of new technologists." He was referring to forced film colorization of black and white movies. Think about that imagery. I mean, it's powerful. In a similar vein, filmmaker Federico Fellini, very famous filmmaker, captured the same connection with the sentiment. Deep down, I feel that criticism of my work, which is the most sincere and authentic vision of myself, is unsuitable and immodest, whether it's favorable or unfavorable, because I am identified totally with my work. It is as if someone were judging me as a man. In the Christian tradition, author Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote the book Walking on Water, Reflections of Faith and Art, she's no longer alive. She's very, very well known. And she wrote about this same, and she said, she talked about the creation process. She talked about works of authorship. Oh, she wrote the book A Wrinkle in Time too, by the way. And she talked about works of authorship coming to the author, and saying, "Here I am, enflesh me, give birth to me." Okay, again, all of these metaphors about artistic creativity, like birth, like the birth process. And again, very similar, those parallels come directly out of God creating the world. And by the way, as early as 1710, Daniel Defoe referred to literary theft as a kind of child snatching, and the word plagiarism is derived from the Latin term for kidnapping. Okay, so I just want to check on time here because I do want to have some time for questions and comments as well. Another lesson that we derive from the book of Genesis and the creation narratives in Genesis comes from the language where God speaks to man and says, "Rule over the world and master it." Okay, and again, this is in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, and Jewish scholars and Talmudists, people who study the Talmud, have actually looked at this language and say, look, this is really the template for human technological, creativity. All right. So in the Jewish tradition, what does that mean? In the Jewish tradition, human creativity is seen as an act of partnership with God. The Jewish tradition understands that man's purpose is to partner with God in creating, because we are in the image of God. God created, we too create, right? And so what Jewish tradition tells us is that anything that we do, really should be seen as a partnership in God. And this extends to our the artistic work that we do as well. So the famous artist Marc Chagall, who is Jewish actually, spoke of when he creates that he likes to take flight to another world. Okay, and that's sort of his metaphor of talking about, his thinking upward, his thinking in terms of a spiritual sense when he creates. There's a colleague, Professor Lim, may know him. He's not an IP person, but he's at another law school, and he was a former prosecutor before he became a law professor, Sam Levine. And he said when he was a prosecutor, he felt that he furthered the purpose of creation by helping the criminal justice system return order to the world. And he wrote, "I too am a partner with God in creating a better world." Another really important aspect of the narratives of creation comes from language, and this is now in the second chapter of Genesis, that says that God blew into his nostrils, this is Adam's nostrils, the breath of life, and man became a living being. That language is really, really important as a basis for why people create. So what does that mean? So Nachmanides, I know there's a lot of kind of funny names if you're not familiar. Nachmanides was a 13th century Jewish legal scholar. And what he said that meant, that verse means in the Torah, is that God blew his own breath into Adam's nostrils. And what breath means, according to another important Jewish commentator, Rashi, is that God's breath is the soul of life. This is showing man's closeness to God. And again, part of that closeness is reinforcing the view that God was close with Adam. That facilitated God's direct endowment in man of expressive and creative capacities by blowing the breath into man's nostrils. So what does this suggest about human creativity? Again, the idea here is that creative expression comes from a source that's almost beyond the author's control. And this idea that creativity is endowed, that it's beyond the author's immediate control, that you're listening to a voice that you don't even know where that inspiration comes from, that language comes up again and again and again when you listen to creators and people who study creativity theory. So here's some examples of that. Roger Sessions, the composer, he said a composer is not so much conscious of his ideas as possessed by them. He observed that very often he, Sessions, is left unaware of the exact processes of thought till he was through with them. Often, the completed work is incomprehensible to him until after it's immediately finished. Professor Lewis Hyde, in his book, The Gift, spoke explicitly of this inspiration coming from above, from an external source, when he said that all artists may not emphasize this gifted phase of creation, but they all feel it. Now, related to this is an idea that in creating, an author does have to get by herself or himself. That's self-transcendence. But there's also the idea of creativity is speech. And what is speech? Speech is the ability to communicate with someone, to draw someone in, to speak with them. You know, so often today we talk about how negative our conversations are and people don't know how to speak to one another and we're not speaking the same language. This is all part of the problem, I think, that we generally have. But creativity is about speech, and that speech really has to engage the other. I don't know whether all of you necessarily have at your fingertips the language of how God created the world, all right? But I will remind you what the book of Genesis says. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God creates the world with his words, okay? If you go back and you look at the text of Genesis, God speaks the world into existence. And speech becomes such an important component of creativity because that's exactly what human creativity is, okay? It is speech. And so, again, I want to go back to the work of Christian author Madeleine L'Engle, who also emphasizes this concept of speech, talking to the other, the idea of self-transcendence, that creativity is gifted and you have to sort of listen and get by yourself, okay, get over yourself in order to really realize your true creative potential. And she writes that the work comes to the artist and demands to be served. And she notes how the artist must get outside of herself in order to complete the task. The work takes over, the artist is able to get out of the way and not interfere. I think the last point that I want to make about the creation narrative, and then maybe we can break for some questions because I would love to hear thoughts and comments. But the last point that I want to make is the last theme that comes from the book of Genesis and these early creation narratives has to do with the cyclical nature of creativity. So this comes from the language that, again, is in the book of Genesis, chapter 2 and chapter 3. Where does man go? And many of you may know this, for dust you are, to dust you return. So man, God's creation, man is cyclical, right? We're here, great, but after we're not here, the soul, according to the Jewish tradition, the soul, a person is a combination of the earthly and the divine. After death, a person's soul returns to its source, which is God in the Jewish tradition, but one's body returns to its source, which is the earth. So the idea that a work is cyclical, all right, that's something, again, that's really picked up a lot by creativity theorists, people, again, such as Professor Lewis Hyde, who talks about myths of closing the circle, of authors directing their work back to their sources. And one example that Hyde gives is Ezra Pound being animated by a myth in which tradition appears as both the source and ultimate repository of creative gifts. He discusses the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who was really happy when he heard some of his poetry being recited by some of the workers, that were unknown, and it made him feel really good because they were the source of they were the inspiration for his poetry. And so when he heard them, at one point reciting the poetry, he thought that was amazing. But of course, while man is in possession of his creative spirit, and this really does tie to moral rights, you want to ensure that your creative work represents your meaning, the meaning you have in that work, and the message you want to give to others. And so if that meaning and that message gets hijacked because your work becomes the victim of unauthorized attribution, or the victim of modifications to your work that violate your right of integrity, which is what the moral right of integrity does, it prevents that. But if you don't have those legal protections, then you feel as though you're no longer the guardian of your meaning and of your message. Because of this cyclicality, this is one of the reasons why I've always recommended that moral rights law should actually expire, not when copyright protection ends, which is the life of the author, plus 70 years now, but rather it really should die with the author. I've always been an advocate for moral rights laws protecting the work during the time that the author is alive, but afterwards, because of that cyclicality, I think, it really should not necessarily be protected. So we can, I'd love to take questions and comments. I will just say to you that in the United States, the reason that we don't have substantial protections, we can talk about that if you're curious, but what the law does look like is a very narrowly crafted moral rights statute that only protects visual art, only some types of visual art. It doesn't protect reproductions, it doesn't protect works for hire, it doesn't protects objectionable contextual usages of the type we talked about, for example, with ex nihilo, which actually involved both a reproduction as well as an objectionable contextual use. And it's completely inadequate. I had always had the hope that that Congress would take it upon themselves to draft better protections for moral rights. I thought I had some hope that would happen about 2 years ago when Congress actually did a report asking for input on the Visual Artists' Rights Act. I actually gave a lot of input. They actually cited some of my input, which was great, but they really did not adopt hardly any of my suggestions, except they did recommend that there should be a uniform rule for moral rights, the termination. But in terms of expanding protection to cover other types of works, that doesn't seem to be something that, I don't think it's going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen in the United States, and not for a very long period of time. But again, what that leaves vulnerable is the author's personal, rights, which are not protected. especially if you're not a visual artist. And even if you are, it's still not necessarily protected. And it leaves us out of sync with the rest of the world. It leaves us exposed and vulnerable in a digital environment in which it's really easy to make attribution violations and integrity violations. And it leaves us really failing to protect the underlying reason why many creators create, which is because of spiritual, inspirational motivations that have absolutely nothing to do with money. So I think at this point, I would love to open it up for questions or comments or any direction that you'd like to take the discussion.
Firstly, Professor Kwall, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. It was absolutely incredible. And I would just like to start off by asking a couple quick questions, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So one question I have for you is, how do we balance the need to protect moral rights while also enabling future artists to be inspired by the work of others?
Sure, that's a great question. And that's always, again, there are many different answers to that. My answer to that, and I detailed, the first book I wrote was on moral rights, and it's called The Soul of Creativity, actually. And in there, I actually discuss what I would do with moral rights. Again, there's no chance that Congress and I are on the same page at this point. But what I suggest is that, look, attribution never really interferes with what you're asking. Integrity could. But what I'm always clear about that moral rights really needs to address is to make sure that when a work is, when a user, I'm going to call someone who's using the author's work a user, just so we're clear on the language. When a user, is using someone's work in a way that would be deemed violative of their moral rights, and if they have the copyright permission to use the work, so I'm assuming you're not dealing with a copyright violation, you just have to make it clear, maybe through a disclaimer remedy, that this has been modified. So that type of protection would never interfere with, someone's legitimate ability to use someone else's work under copyright law. They would never be in conflict. You just have to make it clear that the work has been altered, especially if the work would be one that would be recognized, like, again, in the question of Frederick Hart, okay, that people who know him and who know that he created that work, they were clear, right? They would have known that was a reproduction, or possibly they would have thought it was original, who knows? And so in those kinds of instances, it needs to be made clear that this is not being done with permission, all right? Another example, which was litigated, was Carl Perkins, the composer who wrote the song Honey Don't. That song was used as the backdrop for the rape of a child in the movie The Prince of Tides. So Carl Perkins started a child abuse center, and he said people come up to him all the time after the movie and said, how could you let your work be used like that? You of all people. Those are the kinds of violations that can be prevented with appropriate disclaimers, appropriate notifications, and it doesn't interfere at all with the kind of, the kind of interest that you're talking about.
Well, thank you. And going off of that, how can we prioritize moral rights between multiple authors of a creative work when they have different inspirations and different understandings of the work attached to it?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So one of the things that I wanted to say when you talk about multiple, you talk about multiple authors, it's very interesting because if you go back into the book of Genesis again, and in the area, this is again in the first chapter, I think it's in verse 26. The English translation of the Hebrew is God said, let us make, right? Let us make. And so the question the rabbis talk about this, like, well, who's God talking to? And there's a line of thought, it's the angels or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that was joint authorship, but it's very interesting that if you look at the book of Genesis, you actually have to kind of deal with that question of, perhaps multiple. I think when you're talking about works that are joint works, there's no reason, if you are a true joint author, you may have different messages and different meanings in it, but if you're putting your work together that satisfies the standards for joint authorship under copyright law, chances are you're going to have some kind of shared vision as to what it is that you're creating and what it is that you're working on. So I don't think that's an issue that's likely to necessarily be a problem. However, if you had a situation, again, where, the vision, a use was problematic, and it was problematic for one of the creators and not another, that's okay. I mean, if it's a joint author, both names are still on that. So again, there would have to be the same disclaimers. I don't think that would be a realistic problem in terms of how that could be implemented.
Okay, well, thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to open up the room for questions if anybody else has something that they would like to bring up.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kwall. How does the framework apply when you have something that's instantiated in something tangible? So I'm thinking about, let's say, a book, right? So that is expressive, creative content in the book that an artist then takes and modifies the physical structure of the book, right? So they alter the book, they use it as the basis for a sculpture that's objectionable to the author of the book.
Sure. So again, the first question that you have to ask is, does this artist have copyright permission to do what they're doing? Because copyright law is going to deal with that if there's no permission, right? That's a derivative work. What you're describing is the creation of a derivative work, which is protected by copyright law. But let's just say the publisher allows it. That it's interesting because like that book, my first book, The Soul of Creativity, that I just mentioned, that deals with moral rights. I don't know what I was thinking. I had done copyright law for a long time by then, but for some reason I just kind of assumed the publisher has to have the copyright. Okay, I smartened up with my other books, but so Stanford has my copyright, right? So what if they? Not that this would happen with that book, but oftentimes the publisher has the copyright. So the publisher could license that. And then, the question would be like, well, what happens if whoever they license it to does something with that book that really violates the meaning, the message, the meaning, the integrity, interest of the author? So that's how that would come up. But assuming there's not a copyright issue, right? Assuming we take that off the table. Again, for me, it's the same thing. I think it has to be disclaimed. People, if the artist in your example has the copyright ability to do that, okay, if they're not violating copyright law, so we take that off the table. I think there has to be some sort of disclaimer. That's how I believe moral rights needs to be exercised. So it's not that they can't do that, but they have to make it very clear that what they are doing is, not necessarily approved by the actual, author of the book. So the point is, what you want to guard against is the author's message being mangled and subject to modification. If you have a disclaimer that is informing the public that this is being done without the permission of the true author, okay, then to me that satisfies that. A lot of people have said to me, well, is that good enough? What if the disclaimer is tiny? What if nobody notices it? Well, okay, fine, that's true, but it's better than nothing, right? And it does protect that balance that copyright law has struck between allowing and fostering people building on others' works and privatizing where they can't. And so I think the disclaimer way is a perfect way of handling that. And there's no reason, what I would do again is I wouldn't enjoin it necessarily. I would just, unless they're really egregious circumstances. But what I would say is you have to mandate disclaimer. And by the way, when Frederick Hart got his lawsuit resolved, they settled, but a disclaimer remedy was a part of what happened there.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Any other questions or comments or observations?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here for our event. I'm the president of Decalogue Society, Tamara Steinhauer. If anybody, this is their first time seeing me. And then along with Benjamin Usha and Benjamin Bleckman, we spent like a couple months planning this event, and I am so grateful that you were able to join us today. And thank you to Ben Usha for his connection with Professor Kwall to be able to have this event today. I could not have done it without you guys. So thank you so much, and to everybody who is here today.
Well, it was really a lot of fun being able to see you and to be with you and spend some time with you. And it's always fun to talk about creativity and, because look, we're all creators, all of us. I mean, that's what we do. And so, I think this is an important discourse. And of course, I'm always happy to share what Jewish tradition teaches us. I believe in Jewish tradition. I believe in its beauty. That's why I wrote Remix Judaism. But I just, I think there's a lot of commonalities in many of our religions, and I just think people need to focus more on our commonalities rather than our differences. And if people could think about some of these inspirational motivations, I think we'd be a lot better off and a lot happier. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Does anybody have any other questions?
I might have one more question, Professor Kwall.
Sure.
How do we think about the intended audience of an author's work? How would that impact their moral rights? What if maybe the same work that we have ends up being used in an audience that the author doesn't intend? How does that factor in?
So, I mean, that I think is handled. Unfortunately, there are instances where that happens, and it happens all the time. An author never has control completely over who's going to find their work meaningful or who's going to use or take their work, in ways that they didn't expect. Come back to the usage of songs, by political candidates, for example, that authors may disagree with. And that has happened in every single election that I can remember, right? So, but you can't necessarily change that. But what you can do is, again, you can have a law in place that requires certain types of disclaimers, that the public knows that you're not the author of this song or the song with whom it's associated, the artist, is not necessarily endorsing this candidate. So to me, again, an intended audience, the question isn't the intended audience. The question is, what's important is that contextual violations be protected. And Vera does not protect that, okay? Even if that sculpture, even if that case had come out, the ex nihilo litigation had taken place after Vera was passed, it wouldn't have helped Frederick Hart, because number one, it was a reproduction, and reproductions aren't covered under Vera. And number two, to your question, Ben, it involved an objectionable contextual usage in a movie as the backdrop for an incest scene. That's what Frederick Hart was upset about. That's not covered under Vera either. So it's a problem. I mean, it still surprises me that after all these years, that U.S. law is still, barely in compliance with the Berne Convention on this, and just simply not where it needs to be, and not where the rest of the world is. I don't think that's going to change. There is so many other things that people, regard as more important. And I get that, but it is interesting that we are so behind the rest of the world on this. So, well, everybody, thank you so much for being with me today. And I hope you all stay healthy, stay safe. And you all know where to find me if you want to reach out. Okay. Good seeing everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor Kwall.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.